When speaking about the history of college football, you have to mention Alabama, USC, Michigan, Ohio State, and many other programs. And one of those programs you always have to mention is Miami, aka the U. It's all about the U. It's all about the U. By many, Miami is seen as a blue blood program, and when they're good, college football is always a better sport. In the 80s and 90s, Miami football was creme de la creme of college football. At that time, they were producing players like Jim Kelly, Vinny Testaverde, Jim Toretta, Michael Irvin, Warren Sapp, and more. Then in the early 2000s, they had players like Ed Reed, Sean Taylor, Kellen Winslow Jr., Clinton Portis, Frank Gore, and they had arguably the best team of all time. After the early 2000s passed though, they kind of struggled, but now they're back on the rise again, and they look like a contender once again. So let's get into the rise, downfall, and resurgence of Miami football. 1979 began the rise of Miami football as Howard Schnellenberger arrived as the head coach of a struggling Miami football program. Before Schnellenberger, the University of Miami almost dropped the program a few years earlier. So it wasn't like Schnellenberger was just inheriting this good football program. No, this was a program that was almost dropped by the University of Miami years earlier, and they needed the right ball coach to put it right back on track. It seemed like Schnellenberger was the right man for the job, as he was the OC under Paul Bear Bryant at Miami, and he was the OC for the Miami Dolphins, and he was a head coach for the Baltimore Colts. And when he was hired as a head coach for the Hurricanes, he promised and had a plan to win the national championship in the first 5 years. For that 5-year plan to succeed, he prioritized two things, and that was installing a new offense in Miami and recruiting the whole state of Florida. Schnellenberger's new pro-style passing offense would give Miami the advantage over teams that wasn't prepared to defend that aggressive passing attack. And when it came to recruiting, he wanted to attack the state of Florida, but aggressively attack the city of Miami and South Florida. And that made a lot of sense because we all know South Florida has produced some really good NFL players. He also sought to exploit the freedom of Miami's independent scheduling to gain intersectional exposure and to make the program more national. You can see the progress made by the University of Miami's football team in Schnellenberger's first season as they went 5-6, and it was highlighted by a win over number 16 Penn State. Schnellenberger set a bowl berth as the goal going into the 1980 season. Schnellenberger and Miami would deliver on a goal, as in the regular season, they would go 8-3, they would beat Florida State and Florida, both rivals. They would then improve their record to 9-3 after they beat Virginia Tech in the Peach Bowl. The next 2 years for Schnellenberger and Miami was successful, as in 81 they went 9-2, and in 82 they went 7-4, but for some reason those 2 years they didn't participate in bowl games. After those 4 seasons wrapped up, that meant Schnellenberger had one more season to deliver on his promise to bring a championship to the U. And something about that 83 team just clicked, as they opened the season with a loss to Florida, but after that they rattled off 10 straight wins. This set Miami up in a national championship game against Nebraska, a team that was nicknamed the Scoring Explosion. And this team could obviously score points. They had 9 games where they scored over 40 points, and they had 4 games where they scored over 60 points, including the 84-point game. Miami was up 31-30 with just 48 seconds left, and Nebraska just scored a touchdown and was going for a 2-point conversion, but was stopped, making Miami win their first national title. This meant Schnellenberger delivered on his 5-year plan to win a national title and make Miami a national powerhouse. Schnellenberger will end his Miami coaching tenure with a 41-16 record, a national title, and having to win his seasons in 4 out of 5 of his seasons. After 83, Schnellenberger will leave Miami for the USFL, meaning Miami had to find a new head coach. 2 weeks after Schnellenberger's departure, Sam Jankovich, Miami's athletic director, will look to Oklahoma State to get their head coach in Jimmy Johnson. Even though the AD believed in Jimmy Johnson, media members and fans responded to this hire with the words of Jimmy who? The Jimmy who comments made sense though, because he only had 29 wins, 25 losses, and 3 ties at Oklahoma State, and his best season was 8-4. Johnson's first season at Miami was very shaky, as he ended the season on a 3-game losing streak, including blowing a 31-0 lead to Maryland, losing on a Hail Mary to Boston College, and dropping their bowl game to UCLA. After that season though is where it all changed for Miami and Jimmy Johnson. Johnson created a freewheeling atmosphere where he allowed his players to showboat, trash talk, and run up the score. Also after his first season, Johnson switched Miami's defense from a 5-2 to a modern 4-3, and while the Detroit Pistons were becoming the bad boys of the NBA, Miami was becoming the bad boys of college football. And Johnson developed the Hurricanes into a football program that became known as the Decade of Dominance. In 85, Miami will go 10-2 and lose in the Sugar Bowl. Then in 86, Miami will have their first undefeated regular season, but they will lose in the Fiesta Bowl to Penn State. Johnson's 87 Miami team, led by Michael Irvin and Steve Voss, was the big breakthrough. They would have a game against number 4 Florida State where they were down 19-3, but they would end up winning the game after stopping Florida State on a 2-point conversion. They would cap off the 87 season with a win over Oklahoma and the national title, as this marked their third win over Oklahoma in 3 years. And in the offseason, Miami will have a then school record 12 players selected in the NFL draft. And they will begin the 88 season where they left off with the 87 season, as they whooped on number 1 Florida State 31-0 in the opening week. But their national title hopes were dashed after a loss to Notre Dame. This was the infamous Miami versus Notre Dame game that was labeled as Catholics versus Convicts, where Miami lost 31-30. Notre Dame will go on to win a national title, and Miami will go on to win the rest of the games for the season, including the Orange Bowl over Nebraska. And that'll be Johnson's last coach game as a Miami Hurricane, as he would end his tenure with a 52-9 record and a national title. His teams also set the foundation of what the culture should look like going forward if you're a head coach at the U. After Jimmy Johnson left for the Cowboys, they would then decide to hire Dennis Erickson. Despite the people of Miami wanting other people in the head coaching position, it seemed to work out fine in the first season because they won the national championship. This happened after Miami beat number 7 Alabama and number 1 Colorado lost to Notre Dame, making Miami the national champions. Under Erickson, they would win another national championship in 1991 after defeating Nebraska 22-0 and being ranked number 1 in the AP poll. What made this season even more impressive was that this was their first season in the actual conference as they moved over to the Big East. In 1993, Miami would see their first 3-loss season in almost a decade, and that's when misfortunes started to happen for the program. And with sanctions hovering over his head, Erickson would then decide to leave after the 94 season for the NFL. Butch Davis was then hired as the head coach of Miami, and that's kind of where the program looked like it was going to start going downhill. He would have multiple 9-win seasons there, but he would have multiple 3-loss seasons, and he wouldn't have an 11-win season until his last season. And after 2000, Butch Davis then decided to leave for an NFL opportunity. Miami then decided to promote Larry Coker, who was OC under Davis during his tenure. And in Coker's first season as Miami's head coach, he had arguably the greatest college football team of all time. This team featured players like Jonathan Vilma, Ed Reed, Jeremy Shockey, Andre Johnson, Clinton Portis, Frank Gore, and the late great Sean Taylor wasn't even started. The weakest starter that they probably had was Ken Dorsey, the quarterback. And this Miami team will blow out everybody that wasn't named Boston College or Virginia Tech. They will beat Nebraska in the national championship game, and they never dropped below number 2 in the rankings. The next season, Coker and Miami looked destined to go back-to-back as they ran the table in the Big East once again. They were then matched up with Ohio State in the national championship game, where they lost due to a bogus pass interference call against Miami. In 2003, they were still good. They went 11-2. But that was really the last year that they were competitors. The last 3 seasons of the Coker era, they went 9-3, 9-3, and 7-6. And that 7-6 season was the same season where they had a brawl with FIU, and their defensive tackle Brian Pato was murdered, and they had a 4-game losing streak. And right after that season wrapped up, Coker was then fired, and then they brought in Randy Shannon, who became the first black head coach in Miami football history. The Randy Shannon hire basically marked the downfall of Miami. The first season under Shannon, Miami will go 5-7, making it the worst season in a long time for the Miami football program. The next 3 seasons, Miami under Shannon will go 7-6, 9-4, 7-6, and they will lose 2 of their bowl games that he coached in. Off the field though, is where Shannon had Miami football players exceeding expectations, as they had the 3rd best academic progress rate in the NCAA. And in his 4-year tenure, only 1 Miami player was arrested. But that wasn't good enough for Miami, and of course they didn't keep Shannon as their head coach. And I believe what led to the downfall of Miami around this time was the fact that Florida hired Urban Meyer, and Nick Saban Alabama came along as well. This happening means that more players from the state of Florida will be more enticed to go to the University of Florida or the University of Alabama. Soon after firing Randy Shannon, they would then hire Al Golden. This hire didn't amount to much for Miami, as he had 1 9-win season, and his total record at Miami was 32-25. After they fired Golden, they would then hire longtime Georgia head coach Mark Richt. Rick was the head coach at Georgia for 16 seasons, and there he would have multiple 10 and 11 win seasons, including winning 2 SEC championships, winning the SEC East Division twice, and winning Coach of the Year twice. And it looked like he had a possibility of bringing the U back, as his first season they went 9-4, which is solid, but the second season is where it looked like the U was the U again. Miami started the season 10-0, and they beat number 13 Virginia Tech, and they beat number 3 Notre Dame in blowout fashion. The college football playoff rankings even had them at number 2 at one point. But most importantly, Miami looked like they had that swagger back. They looked like the teams in the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s. The 2017 Miami had this thing called the turnover chain, where whoever forced a turnover got to wear the chain on the sideline. At one point of this season, there was a time where they had 4 straight games with 4 turnovers or more. Unfortunately, Miami ended the season on a 3-game losing streak to Pitt, then they lost an ACC championship game, then they lost an Orange Bowl to Wisconsin. In the offseason, Rick signed a 5-year extension, but in 2018, Miami went 7-6, and then Rick decided to retire. Replacing him would be Manny Diaz, but this wasn't a home run hire, this was just somebody that the players were familiar with. Under Manny Diaz, no Miami team really had that much hype going into the season, except for maybe that 2021 team that started off in week 1 playing Alabama. The Alabama beat them 44-13, and then they didn't do good for the rest of the season. They fired Manny Diaz, and then they hired Mario Cristobal, a guy that played for the University of Miami and a known great recruiter. While Cristobal was at Oregon, he recruited guys like Kayvon Thibodeau, Penei Sewell, Noah Sewell. In Cristobal's first season, Miami would go 5-7, and then last year they went 7-6. Now last season was highlighted by the loss to Georgia Tech, where all Miami had to do was kneel the ball, but instead Cristobal ran it, Miami fumbled, Georgia Tech got the ball back and scored a touchdown to win the game. Coming into this season, the expectations were a little bit different because they had some key additions like quarterback Cam Ward. So far this season, Ward and Miami are off to a hot start as they are 7-0, but it all hasn't been pretty. They had a controversial win against Virginia Tech, where Virginia Tech converted a Hail Mary at the end of the game, but after review, it was ruled incomplete. Then you had the game against Cal, where Cal was up multiple touchdowns in the fourth quarter, then they blew the lead. You also had last week against Louisville, where they basically controlled the whole game, but it still was probably closer than what you wanted. But you can't lie right now, Cristobal does seem to have the U back into championship contenders. As you can see, Miami is one of the most historic and successful college football programs. They were a successful program through the 80s, through some of the early 90s, through some of the early 2000s, even though it took a fall off in the 2000s and the 2010s. But now it's the 2020s, and they hired Cristobal, and it looks like he has the U back in championship contention. Now, do I think they can win the championship this season? Probably not, but who knows what can happen. It's college football, and it's been a crazy year. And that's all for this video. Until next time, I'm out. Peace.